On certain nights, when the air is quiet enough, and the roads are empty, there are people in rural America who swear they can still hear it. A train. Not a modern one. Not loud. Not fast. But slow. Heavy. As if it's carrying something fragile. Something it never delivered. In the late 19th century, America placed its unwanted children onto trains. Not criminals. Not immigrants. Children. Some were orphans. Some were not. They were promised food. Homes. Families. They were told they were going somewhere better. Most of those trains were recorded, logged, cataloged, but one of them wasn't. Tonight, this is the story of the orphan train that vanished from the records, and the children who were never officially alive again. By the 1840s, American cities were bursting at the seams. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. Factories roared day and night. Tenement buildings stacked families on top of each other. Disease moved faster than medicine. Tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera. Parents died quickly. Children survived longer. And when parents disappeared, the children stayed. They slept on staircases, in alleys, inside abandoned wagons. Newspapers called them street Arabs, a term filled with fear and disgust. They were seen not as children, but as future criminals. By 1850, New York City alone had tens of thousands of homeless children. The city didn't know what to do with them, and soon, it stopped trying. Charles Loring Brace was a minister, not a politician, but he believed something dangerous for his time. That environment mattered more than blood. Brace walked the streets of New York and spoke to children no one else would speak to. He listened, and what he heard disturbed him. Children weren't being raised, they were surviving. Brace proposed something radical. Instead of orphanages, instead of jails, send the children west, out of the cities, into the countryside, to good Christian families. America needed farm labor. Children needed homes. It sounded merciful. It sounded efficient. It sounded American. In 1854, the first orphan train rolled out of New York. The experiment had begun. Children were gathered days before departure. They were bathed, deloused, dressed in donated clothes. Many had never ridden a train. Some had never left their block. Each child was given a card, a name, an age, sometimes a religion. But ages were often guessed. Names misspelled. Parents listed as unknown even when they weren't. At each stop, townspeople gathered. Children were lined up on platforms. Families inspected them. Teeth, hands, posture. Older boys were chosen last. Sick children were chosen never. Siblings were separated routinely. There were speeches about opportunity. And then the train moved on. Officially, children were to be adopted. Unofficially, many became unpaid labor. Oversight was minimal. A single agent might be responsible for hundreds of children spread across multiple states. Follow-up visits rarely happened. Letters from children were filtered or never sent. Abuse reports were quietly ignored. But the trains kept running, because America preferred believing the story worked. In early 1894, one orphan train left New York carrying 37 children. They ranged in age from 3 to 14. The departure was recorded. The train number existed. The manifest existed. But something was different. The destination line was blank. No town. No agency. No receiving church. Just a dash. Historians would later assume it was a clerical error. But it wasn't corrected. Ever. Rail records show the train reached St. Louis. After that, the paper trail dies. No arrival logs. No adoption rosters. No county filings. 37 children walked into history and never walked out. In the early 1900s, farmers in Kansas and northern Arkansas spoke quietly of children arriving late at night. No paperwork. No officials. Just a man saying, "Take them, or they'll be moved again." Some families refused. Others didn't. The children stayed, worked, aged, and disappeared from memory. In 1931, Road crews uncovered bones. Small ones, children's shoes, buttons from the 1890s. Officials labeled it a pauper cemetery. No investigation followed, but locals remembered a train, one that stopped once and never came back. If a child dies without a name, did they ever officially exist? For years, the story lived only as a whisper, not something written down, not something announced, just something remembered. In rural towns across Kansas, Missouri, and northern Arkansas, older residents told nearly identical stories, despite never knowing each other. They spoke of children who appeared suddenly. No announcements, no church gatherings, no official placements, just wagons arriving late at night, children stepping down quietly, and adults being told not to ask questions. What made these stories unsettling wasn't just what they described. It was how similar they were. Different counties, different decades, same pattern, same silence. In America, paperwork is identity. Birth certificates, school enrollment, census records. But many of the children connected to the missing orphan train had none of these. Some never attended school. Others attended under assumed names. A boy called Henry in one household became Hank in another. A girl listed as Mary in church records remembered being called Eleanor as a child. When asked later in life where they were born, many could only say, "On a train." That answer was always met with laughter, until historians stopped laughing. Outside a small Kansas town, one that no longer appears on modern maps, stood a large farming property. It employed children, not officially, not legally. They worked fields, tended livestock, cleaned barns. Locals noticed the children never attended school, never attended church regularly, never appeared in town photographs. When questioned, the owner gave the same response every time. They're helping family, but no family ever visited. No surnames were shared. And when the farm closed abruptly in 1912, the children were gone. No employment records, no missing person reports, just empty bunks. Why weren't these children reported missing? Because officially, they were never listed as present. The orphan train system operated in a gray zone between charity and control. Once a child left the city, responsibility dissolved. If something went wrong in the countryside, there was no clear authority to notify. No one wanted to admit failure, so no one did. When the Spanish flu swept America in 1918, it killed millions. Record-keeping collapsed. Entire towns were buried without documentation. For the missing orphan train children, this was catastrophic. Deaths that might have raised questions vanished into the chaos. If a child died on a farm, there was often no doctor, no certificate, no funeral, just burial and silence. In the late 1970s, a woman in her 80s gave an interview to a local historical society. Her name was recorded as Margaret L. She said she arrived in Missouri by rail around 1894. She did not know her last name. She remembered holding a younger boy's hand. She remembered crying. She remembered being told, "Don't speak unless spoken to." When asked how many children were with her, she paused, then answered, "Too many for one train car." That interview was never transcribed. The tape was reused. The orphan train movement has long been celebrated as benevolent. Textbooks describe it as compassionate, necessary, successful. But history prefers clean narratives. Admitting failure, especially on a national scale, creates responsibility. And responsibility demands accountability. It was easier to remember the children who survived than the ones who didn't. In multiple Midwestern states, unmarked graves from the late 1800s exist on former farmland. Children, no headstones, no records. Some graves are clustered, others isolated. When archaeologists requested excavation permits in the early 2000s, they were denied. Privately owned land, no probable cause, no crime on record, because without a name, there was no victim, Researchers attempting to locate orphan train records from 1894 noticed something unsettling. Entire folders were missing. Not redacted. Gone. Boxes labeled for those years contained unrelated materials. When questioned, archivists gave careful answers. Misfiled. Lost during relocation. Damaged by water. But the same years were missing across multiple states. That doesn't happen by accident. When modern historians mapped the rumors, they followed the rail lines. And those lines led west. Always west. Always rural. Always undocumented. It wasn't one town. It wasn't one farm. It was a network. Informal, unspoken, and invisible to the law. Some children survived. They grew old. They built families. But even in old age, they shared something unusual. They avoided official paperwork. Avoided hospitals. Avoided government offices. Because somewhere deep inside, they believed they weren't supposed to exist on paper. They lived quietly and died quietly, just like they were taught. History doesn't always erase people loudly. Sometimes, it just stops writing their names. For most of the 20th century, there was no way to prove what had happened. Stories existed. Graves existed. Memories existed. But proof requires comparison. And comparison requires records. That changed in the late 1990s. DNA testing became affordable. Genealogy moved online. Families began asking questions they had never dared ask before. And for the first time, the forgotten children had something powerful on their side. Science. It started quietly. A woman in Iowa researching her family tree discovered something strange. Her grandfather had no birth certificate. No census listing before age 12. No immigration record. Nothing. She assumed it was common. Then she submitted DNA. The results came back with dozens of unexplained matches, all connected to eastern cities. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. None of them knew how they were related. All of them shared the same gap. A missing child around the 1890s. Unlike official historians, volunteers had no funding to lose. They were retirees, teachers, librarians, people with time. They began cross-referencing orphan train departure dates with unexplained DNA clusters. And one date kept resurfacing. Spring. The same year. The same missing train. Formal requests were made. Access to sealed orphan train files. Permission to exhume burial sites. Approval to cross-reference DNA with historical registries. The answers were polite and final. Denied. No explanation. No appeals process. No path forward. Which raised a question no one could ignore anymore. Why protect records this old? One archivist, speaking anonymously, offered a quiet explanation. Not on record. Not in writing. He said, those files were flagged decades ago. Not for what they say, but for what they imply. What they implied was systemic failure. That children weren't lost by accident. They were redistributed without accountability. And once that happened, no one could track where responsibility ended. If the missing orphan train were acknowledged today, it would raise impossible questions. Who was responsible? The charities? The rail companies? The state governments? The federal government? The answer would be all of them. And accountability doesn't expire quietly. In 2004, a small county courthouse digitized its archives. Buried among unrelated documents was a handwritten ledger. The entry was brief. Children received by rail. No placements recorded. Instructions unclear. The date? April 1894. The document vanished from the database weeks later. But not before it was copied. More families came forward. Stories emerged. A great-grandmother who refused hospitals. A grandfather who never used his real name. A woman who cried every time she heard a train whistle. These weren't coincidences. They were echoes. Trauma passed quietly through generations. There was no single villain. No courtroom moment. No confession. Because the crime wasn't committed by one person. It was committed by a system, and systems don't stand trial. They just move on. The orphan train movement saved many lives. That part is true. But it also erased others. And America chose to remember only the success, because failure at that scale is unbearable to confront. Some children waited at stations for families who never came. Others waited on farms for permission to leave. Some waited their entire lives to be acknowledged. Most never were. Imagine boarding a train as a child, believing someone somewhere knew where you were going, and discovering no one did. By the time researchers reached the edge of the records, something became clear. There would be no final document, no master list, no hidden ledger suddenly uncovered, no official apology. The orphan train that vanished did so in a time when accountability was optional, and silence was powerful. What remained were fragments, a half-written name, a memory that didn't quite line up, a family resemblance without an explanation. History, it seemed, had reached the point where it simply stopped talking. There is no national monument for the missing orphan train. No plaque, no statue, no day of remembrance. Tourists visit museums celebrating the orphan train movement's successes, children smiling in black and white photographs, standing proudly beside new families. But for the children who disappeared, there is nothing. No place to leave flowers, no wall with names, because you can't carve names into stone if you were never allowed to write them down. In 2011, a small group of historians organized an unofficial ceremony. It wasn't advertised. No press attended. They gathered near an abandoned rail line in the Midwest. 37 candles were placed on the ground, one for each child believed to be on the missing train. No names were spoken, because none could be confirmed. The ceremony ended in silence, as it probably should have. Whenever this story is told, someone always asks the same thing. How could this happen? The uncomfortable answer is simple. It happened because the children were poor, because they were young, because they had no power, and because once they left the cities, no one important was watching anymore. People assume sealed records hide villains, but often, they hide embarrassment. They protect institutions from admitting that systems failed the very people they claim to save. If the missing orphan train were fully acknowledged, it would force a national conversation about how easily compassion can become neglect, when efficiency replaces care. Today, the only way to hear the children's voices is through echoes. A granddaughter who never understood why her grandfather flinched at train whistles. A family Bible with missing pages. A grave with no marker. These are the last witnesses. They don't testify loudly. They just exist. It's possible that not all the children died. Some may have lived long lives, loved others, built families, but survival does not erase disappearance. Even those who lived without being counted. And being uncounted is its own kind of loss. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a warning. Whenever society decides that moving people is easier than protecting them, whenever children become numbers, whenever systems are trusted without oversight, history waits quietly, ready to repeat itself. Somewhere along the old rail lines, grass has grown over steel, stations have collapsed, towns have vanished, but stories don't rust. They wait, and sometimes, if we listen carefully, we can still hear the train, not arriving, not departing, just passing through history, carrying children whose names were never written down, but who were real. They always were.